In our lesson, we've been looking at the creation-evolution debate, and we spent many weeks looking at Genesis chapter 1, where our primary goal was to understand what the original author of Genesis meant by this passage. And we surveyed a number of different interpretations, offered criticisms of each one of them, and in the end, I remained undecided. I didn't take a position as to which one I thought was the best. I still have an open mind and am still exploring these. But we did see there's a range of options, I think, available today to the Bible-believing Christian. We don't need to be put into a box and think that there is just one interpretation of Scripture with regard to origins that is incumbent upon the faithful Bible-believing Christian. Now we have turned, the last time, to a discussion of the concord of biblical teaching with evolutionary biology. And by way of introduction, I said that except for the literal interpretation of Genesis 1, that is to say 6 consecutive 24-hour day creationism, that Genesis 1 is compatible with evolutionary biological theories. Now, that's not to say that those theories are true. It's just to say that you could be a Bible-believing Christian and also believe in the theory of biological evolution that is accepted today. Indeed, once you move away from the literal interpretation, it's striking that Genesis doesn't say how God created the life on earth. Indeed, in 2 places it says, God declared, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation and fruit trees," or terrestrial animals, suggesting that there may have been indeed natural causes involved in bringing these things forth. So I don't think this conclusion at this point should be at all controversial. We've already surveyed those interpretations, and we saw that some of them were motivated by trying to find an interpretation that was compatible with evolutionary theory. Remember, we called that concordism, where someone tries to read the narrative in light of modern science with the goal of trying to show the concord between modern science and this biblical passage. So it's hardly surprising that many of these non-literalistic interpretations would be compatible with contemporary evolutionary theory. That's what they were designed for in some cases, and we criticize them for that because we think we need the narrative to be read in light of its own author and audience rather than have modern science imposed on it. Now, is there any question or discussion about what I've said so far before we look more closely at what contemporary evolutionary biology has to say? Bob, and we'll get the microphone to you so we can hear the question.
Please just make that distinction between when you talk about evolution, the difference between how evolution is defined, macro, micro, that thing. So we're clear on that.
Yes.
When you use the word evolution, what do you mean by
I'll say more about that in a minute, Bob. But what I'm speaking of here would be standard neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. Clearly, if you take the literal view that the world was created in 6 24-hour days, those two are incompatible. And I'm not, again, saying anything about the truth of that theory. I'm just saying that if you don't have the literal interpretation, if you adopt, for example, Blocher's literary framework view, or Miller and Soden's Hebrew myth view, then clearly those aren't incompatible with evolutionary theory. That's what those authors were thinking when they came up with those interpretations. But we'll define the theory more closely as we proceed. Yes, Bruce.
Well, one basic, I think, inconsistency, even if you hold to long Earth days or what have you, and you jettison the 6 literal days, is you have problems with kindness of pairs and reproductive pairs and irreducible complexity in systems.
Okay, now I think you're getting into the truth of evolutionary theory, and I haven't we will speak to that. All I'm talking here about is compatibility. I'm just saying that if a person, say, believes Henri Blocher's literary framework view, is that compatible with being a Darwinist about biology? Well, it seems to me that it is, because on Blocher's view, this isn't intended to be a chronological account. It's just a literary framework, and it doesn't tell you how the things were actually brought into being. Now, that's not to say that evolutionary theory is true. It's just to say that an evolutionary theory wouldn't disprove Blocher's view, that you could hold both if you want to. Yes, Brad.
I think the last time we met, we talked about Adam and Eve,
yes.
and they are clearly defined in Genesis. How are Adam and Eve and their story and the Garden of Eden and all of that? How is that compatible with evolution?
Right. This question, I think, deserves more discussion later on, because some of the contemporary theistic evolutionists have argued that the biological theory of evolution is incompatible with an original human pair, Adam and Eve. And yet the scripture seems to think of Adam and Eve as literal historical individuals. They're connected by the genealogies with other persons who are indisputably historical, and there's no suggestion that there's some kind of a break there. However figurative or metaphorical the creation of Adam and Eve might be in Genesis, they do seem to be historical persons. And so one would need to deal with this objection that evolutionary theory is incompatible with a historical Adam and Eve. I need to look into that some more, because it's not clear to me that if a person thinks that Adam and Eve were created through the process of evolution, that say God caused mutations that caused a hominid form to evolve to a brain capacity and a physical capacity that could now be the seat of a human soul, and then God imparted to that body a human soul so that it now becomes a genuine human being. It's not clear to me why there couldn't be an original Adam and Eve of that sort. This is essentially the Catholic view, that even though our human bodies are the result of biological evolution, you don't have a real human being until there's a soul united with the body, and that's a special creation of God that occurs at a specific time in the past, and that therefore you have a historical Adam and Eve. And it's not clear to me why these theistic evolutionists think that that's impossible. I think their arguments are targeting someone who thinks that there was an original Adam and Eve that were special creations ex nihilo by God. And I think they're saying that's incompatible with the genetic evidence. But I don't see how that would be contrary to what the Catholic view is, for example. So that needs to be explored further. All right, now some Christians would disagree with what I've said about the compatibility of evolutionary theory with the biblical account. And I'm a little surprised that nobody raised this objection, but I will now raise it myself. Because, according to the standard theory of evolution, the mutations which serve to drive the evolutionary process forward are random. And because they are random, the argument is, therefore they cannot be designed. Given that the mutations that drive evolution are randomly occurring, this is incompatible with saying that evolution occurs for a purpose or is designed by God or occurs for some sort of an end. But this allegation, I think, involves a fundamental and very important misunderstanding of what evolutionary biologists mean by the word random. When biologists say that the mutations that are responsible for evolutionary change occur randomly, they do not mean by chance or purposelessly. If they did mean that, then evolutionary theory would be enormously presumptuous, because science is just not in a position to say with any sort of justification that the mutations that occur in the history of life occur for no purpose or are undesigned, that there is no divinely intended direction or goal of the evolutionary process. How could anybody say, on the basis of scientific evidence, that the whole scheme was not set up by a provident God to arrive eventually at Homo sapiens on the planet Earth? How could a scientist know that God hasn't intervened periodically in the process of evolution to cause mutations that were crucial to important evolutionary transitions? For example, the transition from reptiles to birds. How could the evolutionary biologist know that that mutation wasn't caused by God with a view toward advancing the process? In fact, if you have a God with divine middle knowledge, and remember when we talked about omniscience, middle knowledge is God's knowledge of what would happen contingently under any circumstances. If God has middle knowledge, then in order to set up the evolutionary process with human beings as the goal, wouldn't even require him to supernaturally intervene along the way. Because God could have known, if I were to set up these initial conditions governed by these laws of nature, then Homo sapiens would evolve as a result, given these conditions and laws, by random mutation and natural selection. And so God put into place just those laws and just those initial conditions. Now, I hope that it's obvious that science is in no position whatsoever to say justifiably that the evolutionary process was not under the providential direction of a God endowed with middle knowledge. It wouldn't even require miraculous interventions. So, I think if the evolutionary biologist were using the word random to mean undesigned or purposeless, then evolutionary biology would not be science. It would be philosophy, because it's scientifically impossible to say that this process is undesigned or purposeless. But the evolutionary biologist is not, in fact, using the word random in that sense. This fact is ignored both by creationist critics of theistic evolution and also by secular apologists for naturalistic evolution. But it became very clear to me in my preparations for my debate with the very eminent evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala on the viability of intelligent design in biology. According to Ayala, when evolutionary biologists say that the mutations are random, they do not mean occurring by chance. They do not mean that these occur by chance. What they mean, rather, is that they occur irrespective of their benefit to the host organism. The sense in which the mutations are random is that they occur irrespective of their benefit to the organism in which they take place. In other words, the mutations don't take place in such a way that they're for the benefit of the organism in which they take place. Some of them are good, most of them are deleterious, most of them are disastrous for the organism in which they take place. So the mutations are random simply in the sense that they occur irrespective of their usefulness to the organism. Now, this is incredibly significant. I hope you see the gravity of this. The scientist is not saying, despite the impression given to the contrary by people on both sides of this debate, the scientist is not making the presumptuous philosophical claim that biological mutations occur by chance, and that therefore the evolutionary process is undirected or purposeless. Rather, all he means is that the mutations don't occur with the benefit of their host organism in mind, so to speak. And if you take random to mean simply irrespective of their benefit to the host organism, then randomness isn't incompatible with purpose or design or direction. Alvin Plantinga has made precisely this same point in his newest book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. Plantinga believes that there is not even a superficial conflict between evolutionary biology and theism. He chastises scientists who have recklessly asserted that, according to evolutionary biology, the evolutionary process is undirected or purposeless, and certainly such claims are legion. But he says such claims are not properly part of the biological theory itself. Rather, they are what he calls a philosophical add-on, an extra scientific assertion reflecting the personal philosophy of the scientist. And in support of this, Plantinga quotes the very prominent evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, who wrote, and I quote, "When it is said that a mutation or variation is random, the statement simply means that there is no correlation between the production of a new genotype and the adaptational needs of an organism in a given environment." Let me repeat that. When it is said that a mutation or variation is random, the statement simply means that there's no correlation between the production of a new genotype and the adaptational needs of an organism in a given environment. In other words, this is exactly the same definition of random that Ayala gave, namely that the mutations occur irrespective of the needs of the host organism and whether they're of benefit to that organism. And this definition of random is wholly compatible with God's causing mutations to occur with a purpose or a certain end in view. For example, suppose that God in his providence causes a mutation to occur in a certain animal, not for the benefit of that animal, but to produce easy prey for its predators, because he wants them to flourish. Well, in that case, the mutation is random. It doesn't occur for the benefit of the host organism, but it's not purposeless, undirected, or by chance. God caused it to produce a maladapted organism that would produce easy prey for its predators. Or even think of this, suppose God in his middle knowledge caused an adaptation because he knew that it would produce a fossil, which eventually I would discover and be thereby inspired to go into the career of paleontology, which God had called and wanted me to go into. Clearly, in such a case, the mutation would be both purposeful and yet, in this technical sense, random. So, unless you adopt a literal interpretation of Genesis 1, which I've said I don't think we're obligated to do, there's just no conflict between the Bible and standard evolutionary biology. And what that means is that the Christian is open to follow the evidence where it leads. The Christian can be open-minded about this and follow the evidence where it leads. And in this respect, the Christian has a tremendous advantage over the atheist. As Alvin Plantinga points out, for the atheist, evolution is the only game in town. So no matter what the evidence, no matter how improbable the odds, he's got to believe it because that's all there is. And so the atheist can't be open-minded to follow the evidence where it leads. The naturalistic biologist Richard Lewontin has said the following, and listen carefully to this quotation from Lewontin. Sorry. This is what Richard Lewontin said. He's a naturalist. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. Now, what is a just so story? Well, the term comes from Rudyard Kipling, who would tell fairy tales, and then he would conclude these fairy tales by saying, and it happened just so. And evolutionary biologists have shown themselves to be extremely creative and imaginative in inventing what are called just so stories to explain how some biological adaptation came about, even though there's no evidence whatsoever that that's how it actually happened. And what Lewontin says is we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment. What is that commitment? A commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institution of science somehow compel us to adopt a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. So what Lewontin is saying is that it is because of their materialistic, physicalistic, naturalistic presuppositions that they are led to their evolutionary constructs, no matter what the evidence says. And in this respect, you see, the Christian is not so restricted. The Christian can be genuinely open-minded, unlike the naturalist like Lewontin, and therefore can follow the evidence where it leads. Any question then about that first point about the so-called randomness of the evolutionary process? Tom?
Let me see if I can ask this. It seems like this is sort of a new definition to the word random, or it's not the normal definition that we would normally think of just day in and day out, right? And maybe I've been influenced by the secular thought, but my hunch would be that if you polled, say, the top 25 evolutionary biologists in the country, that most of them would not subscribe to that, and maybe that Ayala is just sort of philosophically enlightened a little bit and has seen the new light. I wonder, are you saying that a majority of evolutionary biologists would subscribe to this definition of random and what you're talking about?
I think that, Tom, if you press them on this issue, that they would quickly give up these philosophical sloppy claims about randomness meaning by chance or undirected, and they would embrace the definitions that both Ernst Mayr and Ayala give. These are two of the most esteemed evolutionary biologists in the 20th century, and it's striking that they both independently explain that this is what we mean when we say random. And I know from experience how scientists, especially in popular level books and television programs, make sloppy statements that are not scientifically correct. And so I suspect there's a big disconnect, Tom, between what goes on in the public consumption of science And what these fellows would actually say at a scientific meeting or in a peer-reviewed journal when pressed for strict scientific precision. Because otherwise, Tom, the theory becomes philosophy. It would become impossible for the scientist to prove that the mutations are random in the sense that they occur for no purpose or that they're undirected. That would make it philosophy. And I think that these scientists have more sense to that when they're doing careful work. And indeed, the definitions of Meyer and Ayala seem to suggest that.
Right. So just one more point is that if biological evolution were purely random or misdirected,
Undirected or purposeful.
undirected,
Yeah.
is that is incompatible with Christian theology or philosophy, right?
Yes.
Because we do believe that God directs things.
Right. We believe that God has created things for a purpose, that the providence of God superintends the world. And therefore, to say that these things occur purposelessly or without any telos or goal in mind, I think would be incompatible with Christian thinking. Yes, Ted.
Excuse me. If the evolution type thing is correct, like you're saying, they were people or animals or something, predecessors to Adam and Eve, which brought them about being. So death would be in the world prior to Adam and Eve.
Yes.
And it would be Roman, I think it says in the Bible that that's not the case, but Adam and Eve themselves, had they not eaten of the apple, it's implied that they would live on forever, because he says, if you eat this, you will die.
Yeah, okay, here we're getting into other issues. The question is whether or not the death that is spoken of in Genesis 1 and Romans 5 is biological death. And I don't see any reason to think that that's the case. Adam and Eve don't drop over dead after they eat the apple, or it's not an apple, they eat the fruit of the tree.
Yeah.
They don't drop over dead, but they're expelled from the garden lest they eat the tree of life
And live forever.
And in Romans 5, I feel as certain as of almost anything that Paul is talking there about spiritual death, that spiritual death came into the world through Adam. But I don't think there's any suggestion that Adam couldn't have had these sort of pre-human predecessors that were mortal. So I don't think that the biblical faithful Christian is forced to say that there was no death in the world prior to the fall.
And also, I'm just curious because, to me, I have a whole lot of trouble with this evolutionary stuff.
Sure,
I like the first sentence of the Bible. It says, in the beginning. How do I do that? I'll talk louder then.
No, try to get it in the mic there. It was working. It should work again.
Anyway, I have trouble because it says in the beginning. And if I'm going to put my eternal trust, let's say, in this word of Scripture, then I have to go with in the beginning actually means in the beginning, not sometimes after the beginning.
Well, I defended
that way
that. I mean, that's verse 1, and I've defended that, the creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. But I don't want to repeat all of the different interpretations that we went through of Genesis 1, but just emphasize again that among Bible-believing Christians who teach at our most conservative Bible colleges and seminary, there's a wide range of opinions about how to interpret these passages that are not all 24-hour, 6-day creationists. Yes, Matt.
You mentioned earlier about the possibility that evolution could have been a process by which God formed certain pre-human hominid forms and then instilled the divine nature or the image of God on them. And I was going to lend support to that. In his book on the problem of pain, C.S. Lewis makes that very same point. In the chapter on the fall of man, he said that one possibility is that God used the evolutionary process to sort of create the kind of being that he wanted, and then instilled the image of God upon him, and he said that this is perfectly consistent with Christian theology and is not something that somehow refutes what we believe.
I think it's especially easy for someone who is a dualist of soul and body. If you think that human beings are not fully human unless they are a soul and a body, then it's very easy to see how the body could resemble other primates and have a similar DNA and things of that sort, but it's not human until God places in it a soul that is distinctively, as you said, in God's image and therefore fully human. George.
Bill, if the Christian doctrine of creation can be satisfied by God sprinkling random mutations into nature, and that results in the current level of biological complexity, does that undermine, it seems to me it undermines the design argument.
Now, okay, would this undermine the design argument? First, let me say, by way of repetition, that right now we are not doing apologetics. We're not trying to craft a design argument. We are doing systematic theology here. We're asking, how should the Christian theologian view the question of origins in light of the Bible and the scientific evidence? So even if you were right, that isn't germane to what we're saying now. But would this undermine a design argument? I don't think it necessarily would. And here I'm thinking of guys like William Dembski and others who are quite willing to say, or they're quite willing to embrace the doctrine of common descent, that all forms of life today are descended from a primordial ancestor. And yet they'll argue strenuously that this very process requires intelligent design. And often they'll say, even if there are no miraculous interventions, you can still run a design inference. So if you look at the work of people like William Dembski and Michael Behe and others in the intelligent design movement, they're pretty emphatic that they're not arguing for creationism. Now, some of them are creationists, and some of them do think that God has miraculously and supernaturally intervened to sprinkle these special mutations, as you say, around. But many of them don't think that, and yet still think you can have a good design argument. David.
I'm no expert on the process of mutation, but my understanding is you either have radiation damage or some kind of miscopying event where one of your codes changes from an A to a T or whatever. You get sort of the wrong information, and I think scientists feel like that process really is by chance.
Uh-huh.
So I'm puzzled that any biologist would give up on claiming that they do mean that it's by chance.
Well, I've quoted them, some of the most eminent, and if they are making these more radical claims, then I think they're doing philosophy and not science, and they need to be called on the carpet for it. I think Wayne had a contribution to make at this point.
Bill, while I don't mean to be argumentative or certainly disrespectful.
Okay, that was quite a preamble.
In my humble opinion, I do think that you and Dr. Plantinga are simply cherry-picking a definition here that suits your particular argument. If you look at statements, for example, that have been made by these two individuals under other circumstances,
yes,
they have said exactly the opposite, that this process is random. So I think I think they
mean
are
by chance.
Yes,
we're not. The question is how you define randomness.
That the process is random or by chance.
Now, let me say this, Wayne, in response to that. There are certain other statements by Ayala where he says, I don't think that these mutations were caused by God with the view of bringing about these things. But, Wayne, the reason he says that, when you read his work, which I have, he doesn't say that because they're random. It's because of the problem of evil. When he looks at the world, particularly the insect world, which is so grotesque with its macabre sort of creatures eating each other, and he gives the example of the praying mantis, where the female, after copulating with the male, eats off the head of the male. And he says, how could a loving and good God have designed these kind of creatures that are so gross and macabre? He says this must be the result of chance. So he sees Darwin as enabling the theist to escape the problem of natural evil. And so it's a quite different motivation in that case. And so you need to look at these statements more carefully to see the context. But I just reiterate what I said to Tom. I know there are legion statements that say it's by chance. But I suspect these are the sort of sloppy, popularistic stuff that's intended for the press and the popular audience that they would back away from pretty quickly if they were pressed by their colleagues for scientific precision. Let's take Cody here.
One objection that I hear a lot from atheists about the compatibility of evolution and Christianity is, like, we Christians, we believe that God is perfect, like he's all-powerful, all-knowing. So then why would he use this supposedly elaborate and wasteful, so they say, process of evolution, to create people? Why would a perfect God do something inefficient like that?
Yes. Now, let's... these sorts of questions are philosophical questions, right? These are extra scientific questions. Now, the question of the week on the Reasonable Faith website is about this very subject. There's a kid from Germany who writes in and says, an all-perfect being would choose the best way to create. And the best way to create would not be through evolution. So he uses this very argument. But insofar as the anti-theist is appealing to the wastefulness or the inefficiency of evolution, there I think the response of Thomas Morris, the Christian philosopher, is spot on target. He says efficiency is a value only for a creature who has either limited time or limited resources, or both, and therefore needs to marshal his resources and use his time in the most efficient way. But for an infinite being like God, who has unlimited resources and unlimited time, efficiency is simply not a value. It's not important. And so I don't see that the argument from efficiency has much weight. I think it construes of God as a sort of finite engineer whose main goal is to produce this most efficiently functioning process. And I don't think we should think of God in the pattern of an engineer. Much less one of finite time and resources. All right, one last comment here from Bruce, and then we'll close.
Well, on a scientific note, Lee Spetner writes in his book, Not by Chance, that changes in biological beings occur because of the environment of unzipping, in effect, a prepackaged genetic package. The changes don't occur with just small incremental changes in the DNA. There's already packaged DNA, like in the case of the feathered moth, when there was dirt in the atmosphere, and that the one version of the moth became more predominant than the other. The feathered moth didn't evolve, devolve, or revolve. They just the
proportions of light and dark moths in the population change.
One package change.
What you're talking about here now is dealing more with the truth or the evidence for evolution, and we'll look at that later. All I have wanted to talk about up to now is simply the question of compatibility, not the question of the truth of evolutionary theory. But what I'm asking is, if evolutionary theory were proved to be true, or if you think it's true, does that mean you have to abandon biblical theism? And my claim would be only if you're a literal six-day creationist. Otherwise, there isn't any incompatibility. All right, next time then we will look at the question of methodological naturalism, to what extent the scientist needs to be committed to naturalism as a methodological assumption.